The candle is lit. The hour has turned late enough that the sensible members of the household have already gone to bed, and we, who are not always sensible, remain. Draw the coverlet a little higher, if you would. Let the clock on the mantel tick as it wishes. We are going, tonight, to the spring of 1813, to a narrow house in Mount Street, and to a ballroom in Mayfair, where a young woman, quite by accident, will curtsy to the wrong man. Or perhaps, as the kindly fates sometimes arrange, to the precisely right one. The 9th of May, in the year 1813, fell upon London as a pale blue evening, soft as washed muslin, the kind of dusk that makes the chimney-pots look like ink drawings laid upon watered silk. A thrush sang without much conviction from the plane tree at the corner of Mount Street, as if it too were dressing for the evening and had not quite determined upon its best notes. The lamplighter had begun his slow progress along the pavement, and here and there a window warmed into gold behind its curtains, as though the houses themselves were putting on their jewels. At number 14 Mount Street, a narrow house of honey-colored brick with a door painted the particular green of old moss, a young woman stood before a pier glass in a small upstairs bedroom, and considered herself with the quiet, careful honesty of one who has long ceased to expect flattery from mirrors. Miss Evangeline Caldecourt, 22 years of age, the daughter of the late Viscount Caldecourt of Sussex, was dressed for Lady Ellesmere's ball in a gown of pale blue silk, which she had, over the course of 3 long afternoons, unpicked and remade from a gown of her late mother's. The hem had been shortened, the waist raised, a ribbon added at the bodice, and a small spray of white silk flowers pinned to the shoulder in a manner that, if one did not examine too closely, suggested a Bond Street milliner rather than a sewing box kept under a bed. She was not a beauty in the fashionable sense. The fashionable sense, in that year, required pale gold ringlets and a certain helpless softness about the mouth, and Evangeline possessed neither. Her hair was the color of strong tea, and she wore it simply, parted in the middle and drawn back into a low knot at the nape of her neck, with 2 curls set loose at her temples as a concession to the season. Her eyes were gray, thoughtful, and set rather deep, and her mouth had a habit of tucking itself inward at the corners, when something amused her that she had judged it wiser not to say aloud. She was slender, well made, and carried herself with a straightness that was not quite pride and not quite defiance, but something gentler than both, as though she had long since decided that since the world had not given her much, she would at least give herself the compliment of good posture. Upon the small dressing table stood an open book, its spine broken in the patient fashion of a beloved volume. It was a Latin edition of Ovid's Amores, purchased for 6d from a stall in Holywell Street 3 winters before, and Evangeline had been reading it, to the mild scandal of her former governess, ever since. She closed it now with a small sigh of regret, as though setting down a private friend, and drew on her gloves. From the landing below there came the brisk, impatient rustle of silk that always announced her stepmother. Lady Marceline Caldecourt had been married to the late Viscount for 11 years, and to the idea of her own importance for considerably longer. She was 44, handsome in a sharp, well-preserved manner, and possessed of a particular genius for making any room she entered feel several degrees cooler. She swept into Evangeline's bedroom without knocking, her own gown of garnet red, a thing so elaborate and so evidently new that it seemed to require its own carriage. "You are ready, then?" Lady Marceline said, in the tone of one remarking upon an inconvenience. She looked Evangeline up and down with the thoroughness of a coach inspector. "That gown, is that the blue one from Sussex?" "It was." said Evangeline. "It is a little altered." "A little," said Lady Marceline, and let the word hang in the air as though it were a small insect she could not quite be troubled to flick away. "Well, Isadora will be in the white with the silver netting. You will stand behind her at the receiving line. You will not, I hope, speak unless you are addressed, and when you are addressed you will remember that your cleverness is not, in the general, a charm. It has a chilling effect upon gentlemen. Try not to be seen tonight." Evangeline lowered her eyes in the manner her stepmother preferred, which cost her nothing and saved a great deal of trouble. "Yes, Lady Marceline. And pray do not lurk near the book-room. Lady Ellesmere's library is not a place for unmarried girls who have nothing to recommend them but their grammar." "Yes, Lady Marceline." Her stepmother paused in the doorway as if recollecting something, and turned with a little tightening of the mouth. "There is a Mr. Hollis who may be in attendance this evening. An emissary of some consequence, I am given to understand. Should he address you, you will be civil. That is all." "Mr. Hollis?" Evangeline repeated, committing the name to memory as she had, in her childhood, committed irregular verbs. "Mr. Hollis?" said Lady Marceline, and swept away in a noise of silk and an after-smell of orange flower water. When she was alone again, Evangeline drew in a quiet breath, placed her gloved hand for a moment over the small book upon the dressing-table as if in farewell, and looked at her reflection one last time. The young woman in the glass looked back at her with the grave, slightly humorous expression of someone about to embark upon a long journey in uncertain weather. Somewhere below, a door opened and shut. A horse shifted in the traces. Mr. Cyprian Hollingsby, the remaining footman, could be heard murmuring some mild courtesy to the coachman. "Well then, Ovid," Evangeline said softly to the book, "be good until I return." And she went down the stairs to her stepmother's carriage, quite unaware that her father, in his final illness of the previous winter, and in the helpless half-light of laudanum and regret, had signed away her hand in marriage to the 8th Duke of Ravenscar, in exchange for the quiet forgiveness of a debt that would otherwise have put the Caldecourt name upon the lips of every broadsheet in London. She did not know this. She did not know, as she stepped into the carriage, that her whole life was about to turn upon the small hinge of a curtsy. She knew only that the evening was blue, that her gloves fit badly at the wrist, and that she must try, if she possibly could, not to be seen. The carriage that carried the Caldecourt women to Lady Ellesmere's ball was an old town carriage that had once been handsome, and was now, in the polite phrase, well preserved, which meant that the velvet on the squabs had been turned twice, and that the silver on the door lamps had been replaced with tin painted to resemble silver in the generous half-light of a London dusk. It smelled faintly of the cedarwood chest in which the carriage rugs were kept, and of the peppermint cordial which Isadora, who was prone to motion, always carried in a small flask. Isadora Caldecourt Vane sat across from her half-sister. The length of 19 years and a considerable quantity of silver netting arranged around her like the glacis of a well-defended fort. She was fair, as her mother had been, and had inherited Lady Marceline's cool, appraising eyes, without having yet learned to disguise their coolness with the little civil warmths of the drawing-room. She glanced at Evangeline once, took in the altered gown, and then looked out of the window as though the alteration of a gown were a thing too small to hold her attention for longer than a heartbeat. Lady Marceline, beside her, was busy with the fastening of a bracelet, which had decided to be difficult, and which she therefore punished by muttering at it. Evangeline sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the evening go by. This was always, for her, the best part of an evening, better, in truth, than the ball itself. She loved London at dusk. She loved the way the lamps came on, one by one, as though someone were setting the table for a great soft supper. She loved the shop fronts closing, the shutters drawn down, the link boys beginning to gather with their smoky torches at the corners of the squares. She loved the way the city, which could be so cruel in daylight, put on its blue evening manners and became, for an hour, merely beautiful. Her thoughts wandered, as they often did, through a landscape of small private pleasures and small private wounds. She thought of the library at Caldecourt Court in Sussex, now stripped of its best volumes to pay the bills; of her father, who had taught her Latin upon his knee before he had taught her to ride; of the long summer in which she had, at 17, read the whole of Virgil's Aeneid in the original, because there had been nothing else to do, and because grief, she had discovered, was a thing one could sometimes outrun with a good dictionary. She thought of Mrs. Winifred Pomfret, her former governess, now lodging in a small set of rooms in Bloomsbury upon a pension of £50 a year, and of the letter she meant to write her in the morning, describing the ball in such a way as to make Mrs. Pomfret laugh. "Do sit straighter, Evangeline," said Lady Marceline, without looking up from her bracelet. "You are slouching." "I beg your pardon," said Evangeline, and sat a little straighter, although she had not, in fact, been slouching. It was easier, she had found, to apologize than to explain. "And do not," said Lady Marceline, "under any circumstance, mention Latin." "No, Lady Marceline." "Latin," said Lady Marceline to the evening in general, "has ruined more young women than lace." Isidora made a small sound, which might, in a gentler creature, have been a laugh, and which, in Isidora, was merely the acknowledgment of a witticism she did not intend to reward. Evangeline smiled very slightly at the window. A boy was running along the pavement with a pie wrapped in paper. An old woman with a basket of violets was calling her wares in a thin, patient voice. The world, which was always larger than any drawing-room, went on being itself, she thought, as the carriage turned into Berkeley Square, of her late mother. It was a thought she permitted herself only seldom, because it had sharp edges. Her mother had been Amelia Hartwell before her marriage, a clergyman's daughter from Wiltshire, and had come to Caldecourt Court as a bride at 19, and had died at 33 of a fever that had taken 6 days to do its work. Evangeline had been 11. She remembered her mother chiefly as a warmth, a smell of lavender water, and a low voice reading aloud in the evenings by the nursery fire. She remembered, too, the gown of pale blue silk now cut down upon her own shoulders, and the way her mother had laughed the first time she had worn it, spinning once in the center of the drawing-room rug so that the silk had caught the candlelight and turned for a moment into water. "You are quiet tonight, Evangeline," Lady Marceline said sharply, as though quiet were another of her stepdaughter's small offenses. "I am attending to the evening, Lady Marceline." "Attend to it less. You look like a governess." Evangeline inclined her head. She had, in fact, been attending to the evening, and if it made her look like a governess, she did not much mind, for the only governess she had ever known had been Mrs. Pomfret, and she could think of no higher compliment. The carriage crossed into Grosvenor Square and threaded its way through a line of other carriages already gathered. Link boys ran alongside with torches. The facades of the great houses shone. Somewhere a fiddle was being tuned behind an open window, and the small, bright sound of it floated out into the blue air like the first note of a prayer. Evangeline drew in a long, quiet breath and composed her face into the expression her stepmother required, and stepped down upon the pavement of a world which, although she did not yet know it, had already begun to rearrange itself on her behalf. Lady Ellesmere's ballroom was, by the common consent of those who cared for such things, one of the 3 handsomest in London. It occupied the whole of the first floor at the back of the house, and had been done over, in the winter of 1811, in pale green and white, with a ceiling painted by an Italian whose name no one could quite remember, and with great pier glasses at each end, which, when the chandeliers were lit, multiplied the candles into a soft gold infinity. On the 9th of May in 1813, the chandeliers were lit with 150 wax candles of the best Russian beeswax. The mantels were heavy with orange blossom and lilies of the valley from the Ellesmere hothouses at Richmond, and the air itself had the particular sweetness of a great ball at the height of its promise, which is a scent compounded of flowers, candle wax, warm silk, and the faint, pleasant mustiness of a floor that has been chalked for dancing. The Caldecourt party entered at a little past 9. Lady Marceline swept up the stairs as though she had paid for them. Isadora followed with the careful, cold-eyed grace of a young woman who has been told by her mirror and by her mother that she is the handsomest creature in Mayfair, and Evangeline, who had been told nothing of the kind, came last, upon the dutiful edge of the silk, and tried, as she had been instructed, not to be seen. It is very difficult, in truth, not to be seen in a ballroom, unless one is prepared to hide behind a curtain, and Evangeline was not. She therefore did the next best thing. She retired, as soon as the receiving line had been endured, to the quietest corner of the refreshments table, where an urn of lemonade kept company with a pyramid of ratafia biscuits and a vast silver salver of little supper cakes iced in pale pink. She accepted a glass of lemonade from a footman in the Ellesmere livery, thanked him with the small, warm smile she kept for servants, and stood in a pool of half-shadow behind the urn, watching the room. She loved, in spite of herself, to watch a ballroom. She loved the pattern of it, the shift of color across the floor as the dancers turned, the way the matrons in their chairs along the wall resembled a row of great, silk-upholstered birds, each keeping an eye upon the fledglings of her house. She loved the gentlemen in their dark coats and snowy linen, the ladies in their whites and pinks and celestial blues. She loved the small confidences behind fans, the laughter that rose and fell, the one violin that was always a little out of tune with the others, and which nobody, out of courtesy, ever mentioned. It was while she was standing thus, a little apart, half hidden by the urn, that she became aware of a gentleman standing on the other side of the refreshments table. He was tall, of rather more than the common height, and he wore a coat of charcoal black so well cut that it had the air of having been made upon him rather than for him. His linen was plain. He wore no fob, no rings, no ornament of any kind, except a single small signet worn upon the smallest finger of his left hand, which she did not, in that moment, examine. His hair was dark, almost black, and cut short in the new fashion without powder. His face was grave, the cheekbones high, the mouth firm, and his eyes, which she could not quite see in the half-light, were of a color she would later learn to call sea-gray. He was, she thought, perhaps 30 years of age. He was not laughing, and not dancing, and not seeking to be noticed. He stood, as she stood, a little apart, and watched the room with the quiet, patient attention of a man accustomed to observing the manners of courts. Evangeline's first thought, upon seeing him, was that he must be a foreigner. Her second thought, which arrived more slowly, was that he must be the Mr. Hollis of whom her stepmother had spoken, and that since her stepmother had spoken of him as an emissary of some consequence, he must therefore be the diplomatic secretary sent, with his dark reputation and his darker coat, on behalf of the Duke of Ravenscar, of whom the world knew very little that was pleasant, and a great deal that was not. The Duke of Ravenscar, she had been given to understand, was a man who had lately returned from Vienna, who was reputed to be cold, who was reputed to have broken a young woman's heart in Paris, who was reputed to have fought a duel with a Prussian count, who was reputed, in short, to be the sort of man of whom respectable young women were warned by respectable governesses. Evangeline, who had been warned by Mrs. Pomfret of many things but chiefly of gossip, had long ago set aside all such reputations as the small coin of drawing-rooms. But she had not set aside the name. The name of Ravenscar hung over the year like a rumor of thunder. This, then, she thought, was his man. Mr. Hollis, the emissary? The one whom she had been instructed to be civil to, if addressed. He had by now, it seemed, noticed her. He inclined his head very slightly, in the ghost of a bow, the kind of acknowledgment one pays a stranger across a refreshments table, in a room where formal introductions have not yet been made. She, unable to retreat further without causing a small scene with the urn, returned the inclination. "I beg your pardon," he said, in a voice so low and pleasant that it seemed almost a continuation of the violins. "Pray do not think me forward. I have been told that I should not take the pink cakes, and I find myself quite unable to resist them. May I press one upon you, as a distraction to my conscience?" Evangeline, who had not expected to be addressed at all, and certainly not with a small joke about cakes, felt a smile begin at the corner of her mouth before she had quite given it permission. She lowered herself in the deep, careful curtsy with which her governess had drilled her in childhood, and which she had, in the sparse society of Sussex, very seldom had occasion to use. "Mr. Hollis," she said, very correctly, "I am Miss Caldecourt. I should be glad to share the blame for the cakes." Something passed across his face. It was very slight, no more than a faint tightening at the corners of the eyes, and a quick downward glance, as though he had suddenly noticed a piece of gravel in his shoe, and determined, for reasons of courtesy, to say nothing of it. Then he smiled, and the smile was the smile of a man who has made a decision he knows he should perhaps not make, and who is nevertheless going to make it, and who is, for the moment, quite charmed by his own folly. "Miss Caldecourt," he said, "then I am very happy to make your acquaintance. Will you do me the honor of the supper dance?" "I shall be delighted, Mr. Hollis," said Evangeline, and took a pink cake from the salver, very gravely, and ate half of it, and felt, for the first time in a great many evenings, as though the world had contrived to be kinder to her than she had expected. He did not speak as he led her out. That, she thought, was his first kindness. A lesser man would have filled the walk from the refreshments table to the dance floor with observations about the weather, the flowers, the excellence of Lady Ellesmere's supper arrangements. He said nothing. He only offered her his arm, and she laid her gloved hand upon it, and together they crossed the pale green floor to take their places in the set that was forming for the supper dance. The supper dance was, by the custom of the season, a country dance of a slow and formal kind, in which the couples progressed gradually down a long double line, exchanging partners at intervals and returning at last to their original partners for the final figure. It was a dance designed, as all dances are in truth designed, less for the display of skill than for the encouragement of conversation, and in particular, for the kind of conversation that requires the periodic small rests of a figure to give it breath. "I hope," said the gentleman she believed to be Mr. Hollis, when they were first together in the figure, "that you will forgive me a question of no great consequence. What have you been reading, Miss Caldecourt?" Evangeline, who had been prepared for remarks upon the weather, laughed very softly, quite without meaning to. "An extraordinary question, sir." "Forgive me. It is a habit of long standing. I have been abroad a great while, and I have found that one may learn more of a country by asking what its people read than by asking what its people do. And what does one learn from me then? That is what I should like to know. She glanced up at him. In the full light of the chandeliers, she could see now that his eyes were indeed gray, and that they were not cold, as she had feared, but thoughtful and a little tired, as though he had traveled a great many hundreds of miles in a short time and had not yet quite arrived. I have been reading Ovid, she said, in the original, though I am told Ovid is a scandal. He was silent for the length of a turn in the figure. When they came together again, he said quite gravely, "Then you are reading him rightly. There is very little use in reading a scandal and calling it a sermon." Evangeline felt herself color, not with shame, but with the particular warm pleasure of having, for once, been understood. "My former governess," she said, "is a woman of great sense, and she used to say that a book was only dangerous if one read it in the wrong hands. My own hands, she told me, were safe enough." "Your former governess sounds a woman of exceptional judgment. She is. Her name is Mrs. Pomfret, and she lives now in Bloomsbury, and she writes me letters full of severe opinions about the novels of Mrs. Radcliffe. I am inclined to trust her opinions upon novels at least," he said, with the very slightest smile. "And upon hands, also." They parted for a figure and met again. "May I ask, Mr. Hollis," said Evangeline, "whether you have been lately in Vienna?" "I have. I returned in February." "And was it very different from what one imagines?" "Everything," he said, "is very different from what one imagines. That is one of the more useful things one learns abroad." "I should like, one day, to see Vienna." "I hope that one day you may." He said this in such a low, grave voice that she looked up quickly and found him looking down at her with an expression she could not at once read. It was neither flirtation nor condescension. It was something closer, she thought afterwards, to regret. "Your family," he said presently as they turned again, "are of Sussex?" "We were. My father was Viscount Caldecourt. He died a year ago this March. The estate is let." "I am sorry to hear it. It has been a quiet year." "Those," he said, "are often the best in the end." She glanced up again, surprised by the kindness of this. Most people, upon learning of the death of a parent, produced small, polite horrors and passed on quickly to the next subject. He did not pass on. He waited as though he had offered her a silence in which she might, if she wished, say something further, and in which, if she did not, no harm would be done. "You are very kind, sir," she said at length. "I am not," he replied, "particularly kind. I am only sometimes attentive. It is not the same thing." The music turned a corner, the figure lifted them apart once more, and when they came together for the last time, she noticed that he was looking at her with a steadiness that was not quite fair in a ballroom, since ballrooms were designed for glancing rather than for looking, and a man who looked at a woman in a ballroom as though he meant it put her, she found, at a considerable disadvantage. "Miss Caldecourt," he said quite softly, as the final figure drew them once more face to face, "may I say that it has been a very great pleasure to dance with you. I hope that we shall meet again." "I hope so also, Mr. Hollis." He bowed. She curtsied. The music ended, and somewhere between the last note of the violin and the first scrape of a chair upon the floor, he realized, with a small internal shock of certainty that he had been resisting for some 20 minutes, that this grave, gray-eyed young woman with the mended gown and the soft laugh and the unabashed fondness for Ovid in the original was the very woman to whom, by the terms of an old man's last letter, he had found himself, some 4 months earlier, promised. He did not tell her. He did not, he told himself, quite know how. And he permitted her to be handed back to her stepmother across the ballroom, with a bow precisely as deep as the occasion required, and no deeper, and watched her go with a feeling he did not, at the moment, have a name for, and which he would later, upon reflection, be obliged to call the beginning of his life. The drive home to Mount Street was conducted in a silence thick enough to be cut with a butter knife. Lady Marceline had seen, from across the ballroom, the conclusion of a dance between her stepdaughter and a tall, severe, plainly dressed man in a charcoal coat, and she had not recognized him. And what Lady Marceline did not recognize, she despised. She sat now in the opposite corner of the carriage with her bracelet at last obedient upon her wrist, and her temper rising like bread dough in a warm kitchen. "You danced," she said at length, with the particular sharpness of a woman who has been composing her sentence for 10 full minutes. "Yes, Lady Marceline." "With a person." "Yes, Lady Marceline." "A person," said Lady Marceline, "in a black coat of no distinction whatever." Evangeline was silent. It did not seem to her that this was a question. "Who," said her stepmother, "was that person?" "A Mr. Hollis, madam. You mentioned him to me before we left." Lady Marceline paused. A small crease appeared between her brows. "Mr. Hollis?" she said slowly. "Mr. Hollis is, I am given to understand, a secretary of some sort, a man of business. You danced with a man of business before the eyes of the whole room?" "He asked me, madam. You had told me to be civil if addressed." "Civil," said Lady Marceline, "does not mean the supper dance. Civil means a curtsy and a word and a turning away. You danced with a nobody, Evangeline. You have made us ridiculous." Evangeline, who did not think she had made anyone ridiculous, looked out of the window at the passing lamps and said nothing. Isadora, in her silver netting, smiled very slightly without opening her mouth. "You will not," said Lady Marceline, "dance with him again. You will not speak of him. You will not receive him, should he presume to call. Do I make myself understood, Evangeline?" "Yes, Lady Marceline." "Nobodies," said Lady Marceline to the ceiling of the carriage, "are an indulgence we cannot afford." When they reached Mount Street, Evangeline went upstairs very quietly, undressed without the assistance of a maid, which she had not had for 2 years, hung her mother's blue silk upon its peg, with the careful tenderness of a woman returning a borrowed thing unharmed, and sat at her small writing table by the light of a single tallow candle. She took down her diary, which was bound in blue pasteboard and had been her mother's last gift, and opened it to a clean page, and dipped her pen, and wrote, 9th of May, Lady Ellesmere's ball. The ballroom was very beautiful, the chandeliers all of beeswax, the flowers from Richmond. Lady M wore garnet, Isadora in white and silver, and looked, as she always does, like a very handsome icicle. I danced once, with a Mr. Hollis, of whom Lady M had spoken. He was in a black coat, tall, grave, not young. He asked what I was reading. I told him. He did not flinch. He said I was reading Ovid rightly. I do not think I have been spoken to, in such a way, in all the 12 months since Papa died. Lady M is angry. She says I danced with a nobody. Perhaps I did. If so, the nobody was the kindest man I have met in London. I shall not see him again, I expect. London's ballrooms are full of men one does not see again. It is one of their kinder customs. Mrs. Pomfret will like the sound of him, I think. I shall write to her tomorrow. She paused, dipped the pen again, and wrote, after a long moment of looking at the candle. And he asked me what I was reading. He asked me what I was reading. I shall not, I think, easily forget that. She blotted the page with the old silk blotter her mother had embroidered, shut the diary, and put out the candle. Outside, in Mount Street, A watchman called the hour. She lay down in her narrow bed in the small back bedroom and listened to the city breathing and thought that, whatever else the evening had been, it had at least been, in one small, quiet corner of it, her own. If you are still listening by the fire, dear friend, draw the quilt a little higher and let the candle burn a little longer, for the next morning is coming, and with it the small folded piece of pasteboard by which the whole of this household's arrangements are about to be rearranged. We are not far yet from the ballroom. We are only just beginning to understand what happened there. The morning of the 10th of May came grey over London, with a thin rain that was not quite rain, and a thin sun that was not quite sun, and a general atmosphere in the streets of Mayfair, of the world having been slightly overserved the evening before, and being somewhat disinclined to get out of bed. At number 14 Mount Street, Mr. Cyprian Hollingsby, the family's remaining footman, a grave, graying man of 50, with the long patience of one who had served 2 generations of Caldecourts and expected, in his own lifetime, to serve no other, rose at his customary hour, blacked his shoes, and took up his post in the small hall beside the front door to await whatever the day might be pleased to deliver. It delivered, at a little after 11, a calling card. The card was delivered by a footman in a livery Mr. Hollingsby recognized at once, for he had a memory for liveries as other men had memories for horses. It was dark blue, with silver buttons and silver lace upon the cuffs, and it was the livery of Ravenscar House in Berkeley Square. The card itself was of cream pasteboard, thick, printed in the plain old fashion, and it bore a single engraved line of small black letters: His Grace the Duke of Ravenscar. Beneath this, in a hand that was careful but not elaborate, had been added a single further line in pencil: Requests the honor of calling upon Miss Caldecourt at 3 o'clock this afternoon, if the hour is not inconvenient. Mr. Hollingsby, who had, in the course of 30 years, delivered a great many calling cards, took this one upon his silver salver with the impassive face of a man who had, in a manner of speaking, seen battle. He carried it up the stairs to the breakfast-room, where Lady Marceline was picking at a plate of cold ham, with the particular dissatisfaction of a woman whose chief complaint was that the world had failed to provide her with a sufficiently important morning, and he presented it with a small bow. "A card, my lady?" "A card," said Lady Marceline, without looking up. "At this hour, who can be so ill-bred as to call before noon?" "His Grace has not called, my lady. His Grace has sent. The card is for Miss Caldecourt." There was a very small silence. Lady Marceline looked up. "His Grace?" she repeated. "His Grace the Duke of Ravenscar, my lady." Lady Marceline set down her fork. She took the card from the salver with fingers that, for the first time in the considerable period of Mr. Hollingsby's acquaintance with her, were not quite steady. She read it once. She read it a second time. The blood, which customarily resided in her cheeks, appeared to reconsider its position there, and retired to a location further inland. "His Grace," she said at length, in a voice from which a great deal of the air had been let out. "The Duke of Ravenscar requests the honor." "Yes, my lady." "Of calling upon Miss Caldecourt." "At 3 o'clock, my lady, if the hour is not inconvenient." Lady Marceline laid the card very carefully upon the tablecloth, as though it were a small live thing which might, if handled roughly, bite her. She looked at the window. She looked at the ham. She looked at length at Mr. Hollingsby, whose face remained as impassive as a well-polished brass doorknob. "Thank you, Hollingsby," she said. "You may go." "Very good, my lady." He withdrew. Upon the landing, out of sight of the breakfast-room door, he permitted himself the small ghost of a smile. Mr. Cyprian Hollingsby had his own opinions of the Caldecourt household, which he kept chiefly to himself, and occasionally, by candlelight, to the cook. and one of his opinions was that Miss Evangeline had been for some considerable time the only member of the family entitled to good fortune, and that good fortune, in his experience, arrived rarely and quietly, and usually upon a card. Within the breakfast room, Lady Marceline sat very still. She was thinking, at a considerable speed, of a great many things at once. She was thinking of the whispered negotiations of the previous winter, of which she had been only partly informed, of the letter from the Duke's solicitors which had arrived in January, and which she had put away in a locked drawer, of the fact that she had not, until this moment, quite believed that the Duke would in fact present himself, since she had been persuaded, by her own force of character, that a young man of 30 who had been abroad for 7 years could not, in reason, be expected to hold himself to the deathbed promise of a bankrupt Sussex viscount with a plain stepdaughter. She was thinking of the person in the charcoal coat at Lady Ellesmere's ball. She was thinking, with a small, unpleasant chill she did not care to examine, of the possibility that the person in the charcoal coat had not, in fact, been a nobody. She rose. She took the card. She went upstairs, along the corridor, to the small back bedroom where Evangeline was sitting by the window, with her Ovid upon her knee, and her half-written letter to Mrs. Pomfret upon the sill. "Evangeline," said Lady Marceline, and her voice was of a kind that Evangeline had not heard from her stepmother in the whole of their acquaintance. It was the voice of a woman making a deposit at a bank, in which she was no longer confident she had an account. "Yes, Lady Marceline?" "You will put on the lilac muslin. You will have your hair dressed by Isadora's maid. You will be in the drawing-room at 2:45, and you will not, upon any account, bring your book." "Is there a visitor, Lady Marceline?" Lady Marceline looked at her stepdaughter for rather a long moment, as though seeing her for the first time, and not quite liking what she saw, because what she saw was something which had, while she was looking the other way, ceased to be entirely within her control. "There is," she said, "a visitor." And she shut the door behind her with the particular soft firmness of a woman who is no longer certain whether she is closing a door or opening one. The drawing-room at No. 14 Mount Street was a long, narrow room upon the first floor, with 2 tall windows that gave upon the street, a chimney-piece of white marble veined with grey, a pier-glass between the windows, and 2 sofas upholstered in a faded yellow damask, which had been, in the late Viscount's mother's day, the height of fashion, and were now merely the evidence of it. It contained a pianoforte, upon which nobody played, a work-table, at which nobody worked, and a small round tea-table, which, upon the afternoon of the 10th of May, in the year 1813, had been laid with the best tea-set, the one with the gilt rims, which had not been out of its baize bag since the year of the late Viscount's funeral. At 2:45, Lady Marceline was seated upon the larger sofa in a gown of dove-grey silk, which she had chosen for its suggestion of mournful dignity, a quality she did not, in general, cultivate. Isadora, in pale pink, had been positioned by her mother upon the smaller sofa in the exact attitude of a well-composed portrait. Evangeline, in the lilac muslin, had been placed upon a chair a little apart, near the work-table, in the position which her stepmother judged to be the least visible from the door. Her hair had been dressed by Isadora's maid with an indifferent hand, and she had, upon her own quiet initiative, slipped a small sprig of white lilac from the sitting-room vase into the knot at the back of her head, which softened considerably what the maid had done. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was not nervous. She was curious and, by habit, composed. At 3 o'clock precisely, Mr. Hollingsby opened the drawing-room door and announced in a voice of grave and appropriate volume, "His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscar." And in walked the gentleman in the charcoal coat. Evangeline did not at first understand what had happened. She saw the coat. She saw the face. She saw the eyes, which were, in the mild afternoon light of the drawing-room windows, precisely as grey as she had remembered. She heard Mr. Hollingsby's voice, which had said quite distinctly, "His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscar." She saw her stepmother rise in a small, rustling hurry that was not, in any respect, her usual manner of rising. She saw Isadora's mouth make the very slightest involuntary movement, as though she had just bitten upon an unexpected pip in a piece of fruit. And she felt, in the center of her chest, a small, quiet collapse, as when a house of cards is set too near an open window, and a breath of air reduces it, not violently, but finally, to its component pieces. He bowed. Lady Marceline sank into a curtsy of such depth that it was nearly an act of contrition. Isadora curtsied also, with her best ballroom curtsy. Evangeline, upon her chair near the work-table, rose slowly to her feet and sank into a curtsy that was, by habit, correct. But she did not, in rising from it, lift her eyes. "Lady Marceline," said the Duke in his low, pleasant voice, "I am greatly obliged to you for receiving me. Your Grace does us too much honor." "I hope not. Miss Caldecourt Vane, I am happy to make your acquaintance." Isadora was acknowledged by a bow of exact, impersonal correctness, which was the bow, Evangeline thought later, of a man who had measured her within 2 seconds of entering the room and had declined to measure further. "And Miss Caldecourt," he said. Evangeline raised her eyes. He was looking at her directly. His face was as grave as it had been at the ball, but at the corner of his mouth there was the very small suggestion of a smile. Not mocking, not triumphant, but apologetic, as though he were asking her, without words, to forgive him for a small thing that he had not meant, upon reflection, to do. "Your Grace," she said very quietly, "pray sit, all of you. Lady Marceline, I shall not take up a great deal of your afternoon. I have come upon a small matter of particular conversation with Miss Caldecourt, whose Latin, I understand, is uncommonly good, and which I should like, if I may, to test." Lady Marceline, whose composure had not quite finished assembling itself, made a sound that was intended to be a laugh. "Miss Caldecourt's Latin, Your Grace, is a great pleasure, I do not doubt," said the Duke very gently and without raising his voice. And the sentence, which had been on the point of being a discouragement, died in Lady Marceline's mouth. "My mother, the Dowager, was a great reader of the Latins in her youth. She holds it against me that I have lost the language in Vienna. I find it soothing, when I may, to speak with young persons who have not." "Of course, Your Grace," said Lady Marceline. She was, Evangeline observed, sitting very straight, and her hands, folded upon her lap, were pressed together in a manner that suggested she was, in some internal way, holding herself together by main force. "Miss Caldecourt," said the Duke, turning towards Evangeline, "would you do me the very great kindness of a short walk in the square? The afternoon, I think, is fine enough for it, and I should like to speak with you, if I may, upon the subject of Ovid, of whom your stepmother, I am certain, would prefer not to hear further at the tea-table." "I should be glad to, Your Grace," said Evangeline. She rose. She did not look at her stepmother. She did not look at Isadora. She felt, as she crossed the faded drawing-room carpet towards the door, as though she were a very small boat setting out upon a very large sea, with only the vaguest notion of its destination. And she felt, also, that the hand upon the oar was not, upon the whole, her own. Grosvenor Square, in the afternoon of the 10th of May, was quiet. The nursery maids gone into their teas, the gravel paths lately raked, the plane trees in their soft new leaf, the pigeons behaving with the dignified laziness of pigeons who had been fed earlier than was strictly necessary. A thrush, or perhaps the same thrush as had sung the night before, was considering a piece of bark upon the path. Beyond the iron railings, a carriage passed from time to time, and a footman or two went by upon errands, but the square itself was, by the kind accident of a London afternoon, almost empty. The Duke of Ravenscar offered Evangeline his arm. She laid her gloved hand upon it, because it would have been rude not to, and they walked in silence for perhaps a minute along the gravel. "Miss Caldecourt," he said at last, "I owe you an apology." "Do you, Your Grace?" "You know that I do." She did not answer immediately. She looked down at the gravel, and at the very neat line the rake had left upon it, and at the way their two shadows moved together along the path. "You permitted me," she said, "to address you as Mr. Hollis." "I did." "Why?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, with a kind of plain, careful honesty that was not, she would discover, common in men of his rank. "Because when you curtsied to me and called me Mr. Hollis, Miss Caldecourt, I understood within 3 heartbeats that I had been set down, by what I took at first for an unlucky accident, opposite the very woman to whom I had been promised, and whom I had come to the ball, in truth, to observe at a distance before I presented myself. And I understood further that, should I correct you, our conversation would become, within the space of a sentence, something other than it had begun as. I should have been His Grace. You should have been my betrothed, and the honesty of a first meeting would have been lost. I chose, for one evening, the honesty. I am sorry for it. It was not quite fair of me." She stopped walking. They had come to the far side of the square, where a wooden bench stood beneath a plane tree, and where a single early rose had put out one white blossom as a reconnaissance against the summer. She did not sit. She stood very still, her gloved hand still upon his sleeve, and looked down at the gravel for a long time. "Betrothed," she repeated. "Forgive me. I had supposed that you knew." "I did not know." He was silent. Then, very gently, "Your father, in his last illness, wrote me a letter. He was in great difficulty. He had lost, through a partnership in the West Indies, a great deal more than he could repay. The man to whom he owed the greater part of it held the notes of a gentleman who had been, in his youth, a friend of my father's, and when that gentleman died, the notes came, by a long chain of small circumstances, into my hands. I could have required payment. I did not. I wrote to your father that the debt should be forgiven and that no further word of it should pass between us. He wrote back, not knowing me, and believing, I think, that no man of my rank could be kind without a price, offering me your hand in marriage in lieu of what he considered his honor. I did not ask it. I did not expect it. I wrote again, declining. He wrote a third time in the last week of his life, saying that he could not die easy unless he had settled you. I could not refuse him that peace. He never told me. I do not suppose he could. He was, I think, ashamed. And you," she lifted her eyes to his at last. "You came to London to look at me?" "I came to London," he said, "to look at you, Miss Caldecourt, and to release you from the arrangement if you did not wish it, and to offer you, if you did, a life I hoped you would not find intolerable. I had not intended to fall into conversation with you at a refreshments table about the pink cakes. I had not intended, I confess, to dance with you. And I had certainly not intended to spend a great deal of the night afterwards lying awake in Berkeley Square wondering what a young woman who reads Ovid in the original would say to the man who had permitted her to call him Mr. Hollis. She laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her, like a bird startled from a hedge. She put her free hand to her mouth to contain it, and discovered, in doing so, that her eyes were full of tears, and that she was not, in any real sense, unhappy. "Your Grace," she said, "I do not know what to say." "You need say nothing today, Miss Caldecourt. I have put upon you, in the space of 10 minutes, a great deal more than a young woman ought to be asked to bear before a proper cup of tea. I only ask that you allow me to call, that you allow me to become, over the course of this season, a person known to you, that you consider, at such time as you are ready to consider it, whether the man you took for Mr. Hollis is a man to whom you might, without regret, give your hand. And if I say no, then I shall release you. The debt is already forgiven. It was never, in my mind, a condition. You are, whatever you decide, free." She looked at him. She saw in his face that he meant it, and she saw also, with the small, quiet clarity that came over her sometimes in moments of great feeling, that he was a man who had not often in his life offered anyone the chance to say no to him, and that he had offered it to her without reservation, and that this, of all things, was the kindness by which she would, in the end, measure him. "Your Grace," she said, "I shall not say no today." "That is a great deal more than I had hoped for, Miss Caldecourt." They walked back across the square in silence, and her hand upon his sleeve was a little steadier than it had been, and the thrush, which had decided after all upon a fragment of moss rather than a piece of bark, sang once, rather prettily, as they went. In the days that followed, the Duke of Ravenscar called in Mount Street upon 3 several afternoons, each visit shorter than the last, each more particular. He brought, upon the second occasion, a small volume of Horace in a handsome Venetian binding, which he laid upon the drawing-room table, and asked Miss Caldecourt if she would be so good as to read him the ode beginning Eheu fugaces, since he had not heard it spoken aloud in a great while. Lady Marceline, who did not know the ode, and who had not been asked, sat in grim silence upon the yellow sofa, and drank 3 cups of weak tea. He brought, upon the third occasion, a note from the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar, who wrote, in a hand of great elegance, that she should be very happy if Miss Caldecourt and Lady Marceline would drive out to Richmond to take tea with her upon the following Wednesday, if the weather permitted. The weather permitted. The drive to Richmond was made in the Ravenscar traveling carriage, which was far better sprung than anything that had ever set foot in Mount Street. The Dowager received them in a small drawing-room overlooking the river, was gracious to Lady Marceline, indifferent to Isidora, who had also contrived to come, and upon catching sight of Evangeline, laid a hand very lightly upon her arm, and said, in a voice meant only for her, "My dear, you have my son's eyes. Only in your face, I mean. He has not yet the habit of using them so kindly. We shall speak of Ovid by and by, when these others are gone." Evangeline, who had not known what to expect of a Dowager Duchess, and who had been prepared, by Lady Marceline's severe warnings in the carriage, for an ordeal of cold scrutiny, felt a small warmth gather in her chest and remain there for the rest of the afternoon. The Dowager was 60, tall, still handsome, with the Duke's grey eyes and a mouth whose habit of amusement had worn lines of kindness into her face. She was, Evangeline understood within half an hour, a woman who had already decided upon her. The decision, if Evangeline had been asked, was mutual. It was perhaps upon the drive back from Richmond, in the pleasant jolting of the great Ravenscar carriage, that Lady Marceline began to compose, in the cold back rooms of her mind, the series of small ruinous acts by which she intended, if she possibly could, to undo the whole arrangement. Lady Marceline Caldecourt was a woman who could not easily forgive a world which had decided to be kinder to her stepdaughter than to her own daughter. She had, in the long calculation of her ambitions, always supposed that if any Caldecourt girl were to attach a duke, it must necessarily be Isidora, who had been reared for nothing else, and whose cold, fair beauty was, she had persuaded herself, the current of the age. That the plain, blue-eyed stepdaughter in the mended silk should have, in a single evening, stepped into the path of a Duke of Ravenscar struck Lady Marceline less as an accident of fortune than as a small personal insult delivered by Providence. She therefore sat down, upon the evening of the Richmond drive, at the little escritoire in her own bedroom, and began to write letters. The letters were addressed, always, to His Grace the Duke of Ravenscar at Ravenscar House, Berkeley Square. They were unsigned. They were written in a hand which Lady Marceline had, with some care, attempted to disguise as an ordinary feminine hand of no distinction, by the means of enlarging her loops and flattening her tails. They were short. They were, in their way, quite elegantly poisonous. The first letter suggested, without quite saying, that Miss Caldecourt had been seen in close conversation with a young captain of the Horse Guards in Hyde Park upon a certain afternoon, and that the conversation had been more particular than was becoming in a young woman already spoken for. The second letter suggested, equally without quite saying, that Miss Caldecourt's fondness for Latin was not the innocent pastime that the world had been encouraged to believe, and that certain letters in a hand much resembling hers had been received by a young gentleman of dubious reputation then residing in Jermyn Street. The third letter suggested, more coldly still, that Miss Caldecourt had been, in the country, the object of a certain attention from her father's land steward, and that the family's sudden willingness to see her creditably married was owing less to affection than to a desire to be rid of an inconvenience before it became public. These letters were sent at intervals of 4, 6, and 9 days. They were sent from 3 different postboys, paid a shilling apiece to take them from 3 different streets. Lady Marceline, who was not without a certain low cleverness, believed herself, upon the whole, to be unassailable. She had, however, reckoned without 2 things. She had reckoned without the Duke of Ravenscar's habit of attention, which he had acquired at the Congress of Vienna, where letters were the principal weapon of the age and forgery the commonest vice. And she had reckoned, still more gravely, without the Duke of Ravenscar's memory of what had been done to his father. The 7th Duke of Ravenscar had died in 1806, a broken man, upon the strength of anonymous letters. The letters, sent over a period of 18 months by a person who had never been identified in his lifetime, had accused him of a number of things of which he was wholly innocent, and of 1 or 2 things of which he was only partly innocent, and had ended by destroying his health, his confidence, and, by one route or another, his life. His son, Ambrose, who had been 22 at the time, had watched it happen, and had vowed, in the silence of his own heart, that if ever a sheet of anonymous malice crossed his threshold in his own lifetime, he would treat it as one treats a snake found in the kitchen, quietly, thoroughly, and without raising one's voice. The first letter he read, reread, and laid flat upon his writing table. He rang for his secretary. He caused inquiries to be made in the kitchens of a certain household in Hyde Park, and discovered, within a day, that Miss Caldecourt had been nowhere near a young captain of the Horse Guards upon the afternoon in question, having been, at the hour specified, in Bloomsbury with her former governess, Mrs. Pomfret, reading aloud the letters of Madame de Sévigné over a pot of very thin tea. He filed the first letter in a drawer reserved for the purpose. He did not speak of it. The second letter he read with an ironical eye, having already acquired, in the course of 2 afternoons in a small drawing-room in Mount Street, the precise quality of Miss Caldecourt's Latin and the precise quality of her conscience. He caused further inquiries to be made. He discovered, that the young gentleman of dubious reputation in Jermyn Street did not exist. The address given by the letter's author was a haberdasher's shop, whose proprietor had never heard of the supposed correspondent. He filed the second letter upon the first. The third letter, which spoke of the country and the land steward, he read twice with a slow and deepening attention, and then laid aside and walked for an hour in the garden of Ravenscar House without speaking. For he understood, at that point, two things. He understood that the author of the letters was a person within the Caldecourt household, or very close to it, and he understood that the author's malice was directed not at him, but at Miss Caldecourt herself. A mere rival of his own would have accused him, not her. This was a woman's hand, he thought, and a woman's fury. He went back into his library. He opened a small cabinet in which he kept examples of the handwritings of everyone of importance with whom he corresponded. He took out, from among these, a note which Lady Marceline Caldecourt had written to him in acknowledgment of his first call, a note of 8 lines, composed with the deliberate care of a woman who wishes to be remembered as gracious. He laid the note beside the 3 anonymous letters upon his writing table. The loops of the L's, the curious, slightly flattened foot of the lowercase g, the comma that ran always a little too far to the right, the slight tremor, not of age, not of emotion, but of the particular way in which a woman who habitually presses her pen too hard forms the downstroke of her lowercase p. He sat for a long time without moving, with the 4 papers laid side by side, and the May sunlight coming in long bars through the library windows. Then he rang for his hat, his gloves, his walking stick, and his traveling carriage, and went, in a mood of cold and perfect composure, to Mount Street. He arrived at number 14 a little before noon. Mr. Hollingsby opened the door, recognized him, and showed him up without a word. The drawing-room was empty. Lady Marceline was sent for. She came in, breathing a little quickly, in a gown of plum-colored merino, with her hands folded in a manner which, by now, Evangeline would have recognized as the mark of her stepmother's second most considerable agitation. "Your Grace," said Lady Marceline, "this is an unexpected—" "Pray do not trouble yourself, Lady Marceline," said the Duke, very pleasantly. "I shall not keep you long. Will you be good enough to sit?" She sat. He did not. He drew from the inner pocket of his coat 3 folded sheets and a 4th, and he laid them quite deliberately, one beside the other, upon the small tea-table between them. "These," he said, "are 3 letters which I have lately received, and this is a note which I believe you were good enough to write me upon the 15th of May. I think you will agree that the hand, upon all 4, is in material respects the same." Lady Marceline looked at the papers. The color went out of her face as though a candle had been pinched. She did not reach for them. She did not speak. "I do not," said the Duke, in the same low, mild voice he had used to Evangeline about the pink cakes, "intend to shout, Lady Marceline. I do not intend to threaten. I do not intend, in fact, to do anything other than to place before you a choice which I believe you will find, upon reflection, to be generous. Your Grace, you have," he said, "written these letters. You have written them in order to destroy, by means of insinuation, the prospects of your husband's daughter, a young woman who has, so far as I can determine, done no living creature a moment's harm. I understand your motives. I do not pretend to be unable to understand them. You had hoped that the attention I might pay in this house would fall upon Miss Caldecourt Vane. It has not, and you have endeavored, in the manner of some women of your generation, to correct the matter by the post." "Your Grace, Pray do not interrupt me. I had a father, Lady Marceline, who was destroyed by letters very like these. It is not a thing I forgive lightly. In another house, in another mood, in another decade, I should have laid these papers before the Lord Chancellor and let the law do what the law does with forgers. I shall not do so, however, because I do not wish to distress Miss Caldecourt, nor to publish further the name of a family to which I am about to become connected. I offer you instead a different arrangement." He paused. She was very still. Her hands in her lap were now pressed so tightly together that the knuckles showed white through the skin. "You will," he said, "within the fortnight, remove yourself and Miss Caldecourt Vane to the dower house at Caldecourt Court in Sussex. You will remain there. You will not come to London for the remainder of this season, nor for the next, nor for any season thereafter without my particular consent. You will write no further letters of any kind to Ravenscar House, nor, I trust, to anyone else. You will, if you wish, have an allowance of £500 a year from my own estate, since I am not in the business of starving my wife's relations, even when my wife's relations have tried their best to starve her. Is this, Lady Marceline, understood?" "Your Grace," she said, very low. "Is it understood?" "It is understood." "Then we need not speak of it again." He gathered the 4 papers, folded them, and returned them to the inner pocket of his coat. "I shall keep these in a drawer in my library. They will remain there during your lifetime. Upon your death, if it please God you achieve a peaceful one, they shall be burned. I bid you good day, Lady Marceline." He bowed. She did not rise. He left the drawing room and went down the stairs, and Mr. Hollingsby opened the door for him with, this time, a very small bow of a rather deeper kind than the occasion strictly required, and the Duke of Ravenscar upon the step placed his hat upon his head, drew on his gloves, and before stepping into his carriage, turned and said quite quietly, "Mr. Hollingsby, is it?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Miss Caldecourt thinks very well of you, Mr. Hollingsby." "Miss Caldecourt, Your Grace, has thought well of a number of creatures that did not, strictly speaking, deserve it. Including, I am given to understand myself." "I could not say, Your Grace." No, you are quite right. You could not. Good day, Mr. Hollingsby." "Good day, Your Grace." And the carriage turned out of Mount Street into Park Lane, and Mr. Hollingsby, upon the step, permitted himself for the second time in a fortnight the small ghost of a smile. The June afternoon upon which the Duke of Ravenscar at last brought himself to the business of a proposal was one of those perfect afternoons which London sometimes contrives after a week of indifferent rain, when the plane trees are in their full soft leaf, and the streets have been washed clean by the weather, and the very sparrows, upon the gutters, appear to have been newly laundered. Evangeline, who had by this time been received 3 several times at Ravenscar House, and had grown accustomed to the vast, kind, shadowed library with its high windows and its green velvet curtains, was sitting by one of the tall windows with a book of Cowper upon her knee and a cup of chocolate going cold upon the table beside her. The dowager had, upon a small pretext, gone upstairs. Mrs. Pomfret, who had been invited for the afternoon, was at the far end of the room reading the Mysteries of Udolpho with the dutiful skepticism which was her highest form of compliment. The Duke was at his writing table, pretending to examine a letter. He laid the letter down. He came across the long, carpeted floor. He stopped beside her chair and stood for a moment looking down at her, with the same grave, attentive look with which he had looked at her across Lady Ellesmere's pier-glass upon the night of the ball. "Miss Caldecourt," he said, "Your Grace." He knelt upon the Aubusson carpet, upon one knee, and he took her gloved hand in his own, and he said, without preface and without flourish, "Miss Caldecourt, Evangeline, will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes filled. She did not, however, cry. She laughed, instead, a small, surprised, tender laugh, and her free hand, of its own accord, came up and rested for a moment against his cheek quite briefly, as though she were checking that he was real. "Your Grace," she said, "you would marry a woman who mistook you for a Mr. Hollis?" "I would marry," he said, "a woman who would dance with Mr. Hollis without asking what he was." "Then," she said, "I shall marry you." He rose. He kissed her hand, very gravely, through the thin kid glove, and held it for a moment longer than strictly a kiss required. Behind them, from the far end of the room, Mrs. Winifred Pomfret, who had not, in fact, been reading Mrs. Radcliffe at all, blew her nose quite loudly into a large, unfashionable handkerchief, and said, to no one in particular, "Well, I am sure, I am sure." They were married upon the last Thursday of June at St. George's, Hanover Square, at 11 o'clock in the morning, in the presence of the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscar, of Miss Winifred Pomfret, of Mr. Cyprian Hollingsby, who had, by the particular and quiet insistence of the bride, been promoted to the position of butler at Ravenscar Park and given a proper suit of blacks, and of perhaps 4 persons of consequence who had been invited less because they were wanted than because it would have been an affront to leave them out. Lady Marceline was not present. She was, upon the date in question, in Sussex, in the dower house at Caldecourt Court, writing, as was understood, a volume of memoirs which would not, in the end, be published. Isadora was also not present. She had gone to Bath with an aunt. Neither was greatly missed. The bride wore cream silk, made up in London by a Madame Ferret of Bond Street, who had refused, out of admiration for the dowager, to charge more than half what she might have asked. She carried a small bunch of white roses and rosemary. Her hair was dressed simply, as she preferred, in the low knot at the nape, with 2 curls loose at the temples, and the small sprig of white lilac from the afternoon in Grosvenor Square had been, by her own request, pressed into her prayer book. She wore no jewels, except for one thing. Just before the carriage left for the church, the dowager had come into the small sitting room at Ravenscar House, where Evangeline was waiting, and had sat down beside her, and had taken from a small velvet pouch a pearl locket upon a thin gold chain, and had placed it, with her own hands, about Evangeline's neck. "This was my mother-in-law's," the dowager had said. "The 7th Duke's grandmother. She was a little like you. She read too much Latin also. I have been keeping it, without quite knowing why, for a daughter I was not certain I should ever have. I find that I had a daughter after all, and had not yet met her." Evangeline had not been able, at the time, to answer. She had only put her hand, for a moment, over the dowager's hand where it lay upon the chain, and had bent her head. And the dowager, who had suffered in her life quite as much as she had rejoiced, had held her breath against the small, familiar ache of a great kindness given and received, and had said briskly that they had better go, or the clergyman would be obliged to wait. And clergymen, in her experience, were at their best when punctual. St. George's, Hanover Square, upon a June morning, was full of light. The sun came in through the great clear windows over the altar, and fell upon the cream silk of the bride as she walked, upon the arm of an old family friend, up the long aisle. Mrs. Pomfret, in a bonnet that was not new, but had been refreshed with a new ribbon, stood in the front pew with her handkerchief already pressed to her face. Mr. Hollingsby, at her side, stood very straight, his gloved hands folded before him in the attitude of a man who knew perfectly well that he was not, by rank, where he ought to have been, and who did not care in the least, because the woman he was watching had been in his care, one way and another, since she was a child of 7, and had first asked him, gravely, whether cook might be persuaded to make a little more custard. The Duke stood at the altar rail. He was dressed very plainly in a dark blue coat and buff breeches, with his hair combed back and one small white rose pinned to his lapel by his mother's hand. He did not turn as the bride came down the aisle. He only waited, very still, his gray eyes upon the altar cross, until she was beside him. And then he turned his head, just once, and looked at her. And in that look there was the whole of the evening at Lady Ellesmere's ball, the whole of the walk in Grosvenor Square, the whole of the quiet June afternoon upon the Aubusson carpet, and a great deal more besides, which neither of them could, at the moment, have put into words. The service was as the service of such mornings always is. The clergyman read his part. The Duke made his responses in a voice pitched low, but perfectly audible. The bride made hers a little more softly, but without hesitation. The ring was given. The register was signed, in the small vestry at the side, with the dowager weeping quietly into a very fine cambric, and Mrs. Pomfret weeping noisily into a less fine one, and Mr. Hollingsby looking, with great concentration, at a stained glass window of St. Michael, upon the grounds that if he did not, he would become, in his own phrase, quite foolish. They came out of the church under a soft fall of rose petals, which had been arranged by the dowager and scattered, chiefly, by 2 small nieces of a family friend, who had been given 2 baskets each and instructions to be liberal. A crowd of perhaps 30 persons had gathered in the churchyard, servants, tradesmen, a little knot of curious passers-by, and they raised, as the bride and bridegroom passed, a small, warm cheer of the kind that is always more touching than any formal acclamation. Evangeline, her arm through the Duke's, glanced up at him and saw that his eyes were bright, and that he was trying not to smile too much, because a Duke, upon his wedding day, is required by ancient custom to retain a certain dignity. They went back to Ravenscar House for the wedding breakfast, a quiet affair of cold fowl and hothouse strawberries, and a single tall cake, at which the dowager made a short speech, which nearly undid all of them, and at which Mrs. Pomfret, to her own surprise, made a shorter one, full of severe compliments, and one very bad Latin pun, which her former pupil received with the grave attention of a scholar acknowledging a master. Mr. Hollingsby, as butler, poured the champagne, and when he came to the bride's glass, he paused for one small moment and said, "To Miss Evangeline's very long and happy health, Your Grace." And Evangeline, who had known him since she was 7, reached up and, quite without ceremony, touched his hand. He did not, in his long service, speak of it afterwards, but he remembered it always. In the late afternoon, the traveling carriage was brought round. It had been newly painted, dark blue, with the Ravenscar crest in silver upon the door, and it had a pair of matched greys and a coachman who had, the dowager assured them, never once overturned a carriage in his life, which was, in that line of work, an achievement. The trunks were strapped on. The bride kissed her dowager and her Pomfret, and with a small hesitation which nobody else noticed, her Hollingsby, whose eyes very briefly glittered and then did not. The Duke handed her into the carriage. He took his seat beside her. The coachman clicked to the greys. The carriage moved out of Berkeley Square. It went down Piccadilly in the soft gold of a London afternoon, past the shop fronts closing for the day, past the chestnut sellers beginning to set up their braziers, past the first lamps being lit along the pavement. It turned southward across the river, and west along the high road, and the houses thinned, and the hedgerows began, and the June evening settled itself into the long blue slowness of an English dusk. Evangeline sat beside her husband, her gloved hand in his gloved hand, and watched England unroll itself through the carriage window. A hayfield, a church tower, a woman calling in 2 white geese from a lane, a little boy running with a stick, a hawk very high up, turning in a slow spiral against a sky of pale apricot. She felt, in the center of her chest, the small, quiet astonishment of a life that had, in the space of 6 short weeks, turned entirely upon itself, and she thought, without self-pity and without vanity, of the young woman who had stood before the pier-glass in a mended blue silk upon the 9th of May, and who had been told, by a stepmother who did not love her, not to be seen. She thought of the curtsy she had made, that night, to the wrong man at the refreshments table. She thought of the word Hollis, spoken in error, and the word Ovid, spoken in truth. She thought of how little she had known, that evening, of what was beginning. "You are very quiet, my dear," said the Duke, after a long time. "I am attending to the evening." "Attend to it less, if you will," he said, with the ghost of a smile. "I find I should like very much to hear you speak." "Then ask me," she said, "what I am reading." "Miss Caldecourt," he began, and stopped, and laughed quite softly. "Your Grace, I mean, my Evangeline, what are you reading?" "I am reading," she said, "you. And am I, upon the whole, a tolerable volume?" "You are," she said. "The one book I should not, I think, wish to set down." He kissed her hand. He did not say anything further. They sat in the carriage as the evening came, and the lamps were lit upon the box, and the greys trotted steadily southward through the soft green dusk, and the small yellow windows of Ravenscar Park appeared at last at the end of the long avenue of limes. Dear friend, by whatever fire you have listened, I leave you with this small thought before the candle is pinched out. Lives turn, more often than we know, upon the very smallest of hinges. A wrong curtsy in a crowded ballroom, a misheard name, a gown cut down from an older gown, and a line of Ovid carried in the pocket of the mind. The world, which can be hard, is kinder than it sometimes appears, and a kindness given without calculation has a habit, over time, of being answered in kind. Miss Evangeline Caldecourt curtsied low to a man she believed to be Mr. Hollis, and the man she believed to be Mr. Hollis offered her a pink cake and his arm, and the arm, in due course, offered a life. I do not think she ever quite forgot, in the long years that followed at Ravenscar Park, that she had been taught, in one short London season, to trust her own kind instincts above the warnings of the ambitious. I do not think he ever quite forgot, for his part, that he had been saved, in one short London season, from the cold, formal life his rank had been preparing for him by a young woman who read Ovid among the supper cakes and curtsied to the wrong man at a ball. Sleep well. The candle is very low now. Let it go out gently. Until the next chapter, by the next candle, good night, dear friend. Good night.